been a challenging week when you're not feeling well and you can't think straight half the time. So I kind of wonder what this is going to turn out like. Whether it's going to make sense to you, like I hope it. Sometimes I wonder if it makes sense to me. So, but this has been a challenging um, sequence of messages to come up and talk about. In light of all of the recent events, and even some of the conversation within the congregation, this fits along with what some of the things have been talked about. So when we're starting in Isaiah, Isaiah's ministry, we talked about, started in a very tragic year, a very hard and difficult year, the year that King Uzziah died. But it's in that tragedy that Isaiah, he's given this vision of what the future is going to look like, what that glorious future with God on the throne, how much of a difference, how much of a contrast that really is for what they have been experiencing all along, what the world has experienced all this time. He gets to see where everything is supposed to be going. We don't know how old he was when he started his ministry, but we know it lasted about 40 years. He was witnessing firsthand the decline of the northern kingdom of Israel. He gets to see that spiritual struggle in the southern kingdom of Judah, as displayed even by their king, by King Uzziah himself, who in his pride, if you remember, he had entered into the temple to burn incense when he was not allowed to or supposed to, and he was struck with Zarat, he was struck with leprosy. We saw that in 2 Chronicles. When Uzziah, when he became strong, his heart grew so haughty that he acted corruptly, for he trespassed against Adonai his God by entering into the temple of Adonai to burn incense upon the altar of incense. A couple verses later, it says, Then Uzziah, he was opposed by some of the priests. Uzziah, who had the censer in his hand, ready to burn incense, became angry, and while he was raging at them, at the Kohanim, the Zarat broke out on his forehead right in front of the priests in the house of Adonai beside the incense altar. Verse 21, it says, King Uzziah had this leprosy. He had the Zarat until the day of his death. He lived in a separate house with Zarat, for he was cut off from the house of Adonai. And Jotham his son was in charge of the king's house and governed the people of the land. So he was never permitted in the temple again and had to live outside the palace. So in a lot of ways, he was symptomatic of the spiritual state of even the southern kingdom of Judah. Isaiah refers to his situation several times in the early chapters of his book, of his prophecy. Because remember, it's because he was so haughty in his own eyes, he was so filled with pride that he thought he could go and cross a barrier that was not meant for him to do. And so when you read in Isaiah, he says things like this in chapter 2, verse 11. It says, The man of haughty eyes is humbled, the lofty ones brought low, for Adonai alone will be exalted in that day. For the day of Adonai Tzavaot will be against anyone proud and haughty, and against anyone lifted up, he will be humbled. All right, that's what Uzziah experienced. He says in verse 17, he says, The pride of man will be humbled, the arrogance of men abased, for Adonai alone will be exalted in that day. This pride, it's nothing unique to Uzziah, but this pride is going to be dealt with, whether it's in an individual like Uzziah or whether it's in an entire nation. And no nation is going to be exempt from that, whether it's his chosen nation, his chosen people, or even the pagan nation that's out there. Because as Isaiah chapter 2 and Isaiah chapter 6, it reminds us, it's the mountain of the Lord that's going to be raised up above all the others, and all are going to be brought low, and all are going to be humbled before him. That was true then, Is it still true today? Yeah, it sure is. All will be going up to the mountain of Adonai to be taught his ways and to walk in his path. And our pride must be humbled, because our pride most commonly takes the form of idolatry. When you look at that passage there, Isaiah 2:17 continues on, says the idols will completely pass away. See, the pride of man is such that the first idol of a proud man is who? Himself. The first idol of a proud man is himself. And the idols are going to pass away. Verse 19 says, people will go into the caves of the rocks and into the holes of the earth because of the fear of Adonai and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth. In that day, a man will cast away his idols. That's a way of showing that his pride is broken. He will cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made to worship, to the moles and to the bats. So what we need to understand is that there is a direct relationship between pride and idolatry. Y'all realize that? There is a direct relationship between pride and idolatry. The more a nation celebrates pride, the more they are really filled with idolatry. So the more pride and the more idolatry, what does that say about the speed of decline? The more pride, the more idolatry, the more rapid the decline. How's America doing on that front? I mean, do we have issues with pride? I mean, do we celebrate pride in this country? Do we have like a whole month dedicated to pride? And so are we full of idolatry? Yeah, we really are. Is it any wonder that we are in decline? And when you look at the process of decline, it's important to pay attention to what Isaiah says that God targets when he wants to humble a nation. And you tell me if you see any of this stuff today. In chapter 3, verse 1, he says, for behold, the Lord Adonai Tzavaot takes from Jerusalem and from Judah supply and support, every supply of bread and every supply of water. Supply and support. To me, those are kind of military terms, things required to have a functioning army. You've got to have plenty of supplies. You've got to have plenty of support crew to supplement your fighters. And so it's talking about taking away every kind of things that you need to keep things running and going smoothly. Every kind of security, every kind of defense. The original word has to do with, like, if you have a staff, something that you're leaning on for support, something that you're depending on. And the most basic supply that any type of unit or military needs is food and water. Right? Have we had any supply issues in the last few years? I don't know if anybody noticed that. Things not being on the shelves. Even baby formula. Remember that when that was such a big deal? Toilet paper, thank you. Yeah. Got to have that. Have our food sources been compromised at all? Are they getting more and more expensive and difficult to pay for? Then it talks about, it says, your mighty man and man of war, judge and prophet, fortune teller and elder, your best warriors, your fighting men and your military, it gets removed and reduced. A culture where most of the men don't either qualify for the military or refuse to participate. I don't know if that sounds like us at all. Your talks about your judges. The good ones are harder and harder to find. The ones with less and less of an agenda, less and less of a bias, less and less willing to receive a bribe. In such a case, when judges, the good ones, become harder to find, it becomes more and more difficult to trust their decisions, doesn't it? It becomes more and more difficult to trust the system And what happens if it turns against you? Right? Do you trust the outcomes? Are we having issues with that at all in our day, with our justice system? When it talks about your prophets, those who are supposed to be teaching the truth of God, are they more common or are they less common these days? They're less common. Even things that, God doesn't necessarily look favorably upon, but do people depend on and go to like fortune tellers, diviners, false prophets? Yeah, he's like, you're not even going to have that. Even those things that people try to turn to are going to fail and become less trustworthy and believable. I liken these kind of things to the futurists, the technology type of people, those who project the coming changes and advances, the forecasters of the economy, of technology, of the climate, all that kind of stuff. How reliable are those things these days? Then it talks about the elder, the age. We have these generations. We have generations that we're living longer and longer, governing longer and longer, and yet they're showing greater and greater signs of decline, and we're still putting them in positions of power. He goes on in verse 3. He says, the captains of 50 are man of rank, counselor, crafty magician, and cunning charmer. These are like some of your more local leaders, your homeowners associations, your neighborhood watch, your city council or school board. The counselors, those who are supposed to be providing wisdom and common sense. How's common sense doing in our world these days? It'll be so bad that the crafty magician and the cunning charmer, as it talks about there, even the charlatans and the cheats, those who seem like they have power, those who act like they know everything, even they are going to be worthless. And since the elders have already kind of seen a decline, since they've already been removed in many respects, then the people will start even elevating children to positions of leadership. I will set children as their rulers. Capricious ones will govern them. Haven't we seen in the last few years that we're told by the media that we should always listen and follow the wisdom of the children, right? Like a few years ago, it was the climate activist Greta Thunberg and such. Y'all remember her? She's still around. Yes, I know. She's just not a child anymore, but you're supposed to listen to them on everything and just trust everything they say, because the children are supposed to be the spiritually pure, right? The innocent, right? They're supposed to give us wisdom on climate change, on gun control. Now you have to listen to the wisdom of 5-year-olds because they can choose their gender and all that kind of stuff, right? And even capricious ones. What does capricious mean? Capricious is unstable, impulsive, and unpredictable as your leadership. I don't know if y'all have seen anything like that in the last, 7 or 8 years or so. Whether you like them or not, we have that. Verse 5 goes on. It says, the people will oppress one another, each one by his fellow, each one by his neighbor. So they're no longer really supporting and encouraging each other. They're trying to get each other into trouble. It says, the child will be insolent to the aged, dishonorable to the honorable. And when a man takes hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, you have a cloak, you be our ruler, this ruin is under your charge. Verse 6 is telling, at some point, there's going to be such a lack of leadership and such a lack of direction that they'll consider anything as a qualification for leadership. What does it say here? The only qualification of leadership is, man, you've got a shirt on. You've got a cloak. You've got something. So you be the ruler. That'd be the equivalent of saying, you've got your shoes on. You can count past your fingers and toes. You be our leader. That's how low the bar is getting. These standards and qualifications to get into positions of power and to govern, and what they have left, this ruin is under your charge. You're going to be in charge of this burning heap. Chapter 5 goes on to describe this what he targets, what he goes after in this decline. He says, "Woe to those who join house to house and merge field to field until there is no room, and you will live alone in the midst of the land." It's hard not to notice. Have y'all, I mean, we're not even in the big city, right? You notice how when they build neighborhoods and housing in big cities, what do they tend to do? They smash everything into as small of a building as possible. They build it as tall as possible. They stack people on top of each other, right? They build join house to house, merge field to field. Have y'all noticed what they're doing with the neighborhoods that they're building around here lately? With all the different houses. How close together are all those houses? They're a lot more jam-packed than they used to be. They're built up. They're right next to each other. Very little yard. All that kind of stuff. They're kind of maximizing as many people as possible into as small of a space as possible. Woe to those who join these things together to where there is no room. And you will live alone in the midst of the land. It says, "In my ears Adonai Tzavaot has said, surely many houses will be desolate, even grand and fine ones with no occupants." How many of y'all remember the housing market back in 2008 and 9? Y'all remember that? We were in Illinois at the time. When the housing market crashed, or like now when the interest rate is so high, they had built all of these new homes anticipating all these people to come in and buy them by the thousands and make all this kind of money. When we were up there in Illinois, they had maybe 10 to 15% occupancy on houses that had been completed for more than a year and a half, 2 years. They had built all of these great houses, and they were mostly empty. I wonder what's going to happen in the days ahead with all of this new building that they're doing now. How many of them are going to be sitting empty because people cannot afford to buy them because the interest rates are as high as they are? Right? Then it comes to our food supply again. In verse 10, it says, 10 acres of vineyard will yield 6 gallons, and an omer of seed will yield 1 ephah. That's not very much now, is it? This is talking about unproductivity in the land, where you're not getting as much out of the property that you have or the farming that you're putting in. Y'all realize a lot of our farmers in this country are being paid not to grow any crops on their property. Does that make a lot of sense? Are there lots of reasons given why it's like, wait, it's better if you don't grow anything? Are they given lots of reasons for that? Sure. Governments are starting to even mandate, you're seeing this around the world in the last few years, they're mandating that farmers no longer use fertilizer or no longer use other tried and true methods to increase yields. What's the motive in all of that? Yes, it is climate change on that one. Very true. But what they're doing is creating food shortages. What they're doing is increasing the prices of all of these things. That's a sign of a nation and a culture in decline. Because they see the people as the problem. Not enough people are seeing this at all. Not enough people are aware of what's going on, and they're not able to see what God is doing. So you have chapter 5 He says, therefore, that's not the same verse. My people are in captivity for lack of knowledge. Their honorable men are famished, and their multitudes parched with thirst. What should be a successful people are in reality struggling to have enough to eat and to drink. And when those basics are not met, when they're more worried about just getting by, paycheck to paycheck, just figuring out those things, then they're less likely, less able to fight or push back on the important issues that are coming their way, especially issues like good and versus evil, because a declining nation is going to have lost its moral compass. Everything will be thrown and torn upside down. Long-standing norms get redefined. Marriage, family, men and women, strange new words, start appearing like a birthing person and tolerance and chest feeding and all that other kind of crazy stuff. He says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who present darkness as light and light as darkness, who present bitter as sweet and sweet as bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. That's a declining culture. Are we seeing any of that in our day? Sure we are. And as a result, the very foundation of a nation collapses because it's rejecting God's ways, it's rejecting His instruction, it's rejecting His Torah, all of these things. Verse 24 says, therefore, as a tongue of fire consumes straw, and as the chaff collapses into the flame, so their root will be like rot, and their blossoms will go up like dust, for they have rejected the Torah of Adonai Tzavaot, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. All of this should be expected, because that's what God said He would do. It's the standard that He said He was going to hold all these nations to, including His own, even using other nations as instruments against His own. In verse 26, He says, He will lift up a banner to the nations far off, and will whistle for them from the ends of the earth. Look, swiftly, speedily they come. None will be weary, none will stumble among them, none will slumber or sleep. No belt will be loose at the waist, no strap of sandal be broken. Their arrows are sharp and all their bows bent. Their horse hooves will be like flint, and their wheels like a whirlwind. All of this, and all the things that we're seeing in our day, should be no surprise. All this decline and rejection of Him brings great suffering, pain, and struggle. And yet, in the midst of that, the vision of those last days is what He always wants you to hold on to. The vision of the last day remains, of the mountain of Adonai towering over all of the mountains, of witnessing the decline. Witnessing the decline should create in the people who see it and who recognize it and who know what's happening, should create a great longing for the true King to be on the throne. It should, where we see Him high and exalted, seated on the throne with the train of His robe filling the temple, a longing for the reign of Messiah from Jerusalem, when the nations come and are submitted to Him and are humbled before Him, when all want to be taught His ways, when all want to walk His paths, when the Torah goes forth from Zion over all the earth, and that's when all the weapons and all of those things that we have built for destruction will be repurposed even into farm tools, and no one will make war anymore. If we genuinely see the decline, then we should have a greater longing for the true King. And what we are witnessing in our day should create in God's people a growing desire for Messiah to establish His kingdom, should motivate motivate his people to consider how to hasten the day approaching. But the king on the throne, that happens in the last days, right? What happens between now and then? How does the world get from where it was, even in Isaiah's day, even though we're seeing the same pattern now with a king, where they had a king with tzarat, with leprosy, to a pure and undefiled Messiah? Part of Isaiah's vision was even hard for him to, I think, fully grasp and make sense of. It was hard for him to see it all clearly. Because even in the amidst the threat of a world superpower like Assyria, it started with something much smaller than that. Getting from there to the reign of the king, it started with the sign of a child. In chapter 7, it says, Adonai spoke again to Ahaz. That was the grandson of Uzziah. Ask for a sign from Adonai your God, from the depths of Sheol or the heights of heaven. But Ahaz said, I won't ask. I wouldn't test Adonai. Then he said, Hear now, house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men? Will you also weary my God? He gave you permission to ask. Therefore Adonai himself will give you a sign. He says, Behold, the virgin will conceive. When she is giving birth to a son, she will call his name Immanuel. This is in the immediate context of about 730 BC, about 7 or 8 years before the fall of the northern kingdom. He was trying to encourage Ahaz, king of Judah, to stand firm, not cave into the threats and attacks from Israel, called Ephraim in these passages. In this context, who was partnering with the king of Aram in Damascus. They wanted Judah to join with them in an alliance against that growing power of Assyria. And when Judah refused, they started attacking. Isaiah told Ahaz, he used to say to him, Keep calm and be quiet. Do not fear, nor be faint-hearted because of these 2 stubs of smoldering firebrands. And in verse 9 he says, If you do not trust, you will not stand. That's what this sign is for. That's what the sign was to try to reassure them about. The child was to be the sign and proof that those 2 would not be a threat for much longer. He goes on, he says, before the child was even old enough to know how to choose good and bad, they would be defeated. And again, it proved to be true, because they were out of power by 722 BC. Israel was overthrown and taken off into captivity. The child, Immanuel, God was with Ahaz. God was with Judah. He would protect his people. Even though he brought this pagan nation to judge the declining northern kingdom for breaking the covenant. And so the prophecy, how many of y'all grew up hearing the virgin will conceive and give birth to a child, right? And you shall call him Immanuel. When did y'all hear that? Every December, right? Every December we heard that verse. How many of y'all really knew what it was referring to and what it was talking about? Did that ever get talked about? Hardly ever. Hardly ever. It has this immediate context. But this is a perfect example of how the words of the Torah, the words of the prophets, are often layered with meaning and levels of fulfillment. There's the plain reading of the text, then there's all these hints, and there's these secrets, there's this immediate fulfillment of things, but there's also a distant fulfillment. When you listen to some of the rabbis, they talk about it in terms of 4 levels of interpretation. They call it the pardes, right? With the peshat, which is the plain and simple, straightforward, literal kind of meaning. Then there's the remez, which is like hints, hidden or symbolic meaning, where they use things like gematria, where they use like linguistic things to try to connect different verses together that it might be harder to see straightforward. Then there's the drash, which is the to inquire or seek, where you're seeking like the meaning or the moral teaching or the legal rulings. And then there's what's called the sod, which is the secret or the mysteries. So they'll talk about interpretation in those four kind of levels. So to say that this passage about the sign of a child reaching far beyond the pshat, the plain or the simple, immediate context, is consistent with how the Jewish people interpret the Scriptures. To say it speaks of Messiah is how it was the first century and interpreted and saw it fulfilled. Matthew chapter 1, it says, while he considered these things, this is talking about Joseph. When he found out about Miriam's pregnancy, it says, behold, an angel of Adonai appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Miriam as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Ruach HaKodesh. She will give birth to a son, and you shall call his name Yeshua, for he will save his people from their sins. It says, now all of this took place to fulfill what was spoken by Adonai through the prophet, saying, behold, the virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son, and they shall call his name Immanuel, which means God with us. To get to the point in history with the king on the throne in power and glory, to the one that reverses all of the decline, to the one that judges the nations and ends warfare in the world, Immanuel has to come first. The New Testament writers draw many descriptions of Messiah from Isaiah. They draw many scriptures of saying this is fulfilling the prophet. One of the more significant descriptions is that of rejection. In chapter 8, it says, Adonai Tzavaot, him you will sanctify, and let him be your fear, trembling at him. He will be a sanctuary, but a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of the houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Essentially, a stone or rock of stumbling. And that's spoken of again in Psalm 118, which is the last psalm of the Hallel Psalms, sung at all of the feasts. He says, I give you thanks because you have answered me and have become my Yeshua, my salvation. The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone, and it is from Adonai, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Yeshua himself referenced this in Matthew 21, and when he was talking about the parable, drash on the vineyard owner. Paul refers to this passage in Romans chapter 9. Peter refers to it in 1 Peter chapter 2. He says, for it says in Scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a stone, a chosen precious cornerstone, and whoever trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now the value is for you who keep trusting. But for those who do not trust, the stone which the builders rejected, this one has become the chief cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. Much like Joseph was rejected by his brothers, driven out among the nations, become unrecognizable while he was living out there among the Egyptians. That exalted future starts with rejection. Isaiah 53, it says, for he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nor beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. All of these things fit together. And in the midst of all of this description of rejection comes again a description of this child as one who is high and exalted. Isaiah 9. Again, we only hear this passage certain times of the year. For to us a child is born, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulder. His name will be called a Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, My Father of Eternity, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and shalom there shall be no end. And on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it, uphold it through justice and righteousness from now on until forevermore. The zeal of Adonai Tzavaot will accomplish this. Isaiah's vision of the one to come who will bring about the vision of the Messianic Kingdom jumps back and forth from these descriptions of rejection and exaltation, almost as if he has trouble distinguishing between them because he's seeing both. When looking ahead, when you think about what's coming, when you're anticipating the future, when you look ahead, it's your perspective and your vantage point that makes a huge difference in what you can see, what you can perceive, and what you can understand. Y'all realize that? Isaiah is in the midst of all of that. He's seeing all of this. How many of y'all remember this picture from a few years ago? Y'all remember seeing that one? Can you tell what it is? It's camels, right? But where are the camels? What you're actually seeing is mostly you're seeing the shadows of the camel. You're looking at them from straight up. It's kind of like that. Your vantage point and your perspective makes a whole lot of difference on what you can see and what you can understand, right? Whether you're above them entirely, or you're getting one view, one shot, one perspective. If you're a little bit to the side, if you're right next to them. Then there's this one, and sometimes it's hard to determine whether things are coming or going, right? And then this was another one that made the rounds a little while ago. Is how many are there? Right? See, what Isaiah sees as though the coming sign, the oath, something that's functions like the sun, moon, and stars, this child Immanuel, that in one sentence is rejected, but the next is exalted, is much like these perspectives that make perception and understanding difficult. Isaiah was looking forward, like Abraham was looking forward to seeing his day, could not always separate what he was seeing. And it's nice because we live around the mountains, and you think about it like the mountains. Sometimes they are easy to tell apart, right? You can see distinctive peaks and mountains and things like that. Other times it can be a little more difficult. When you're looking at things like this, some of the distances become more challenging, right? How far apart are those mountains? Can you tell? It's hard to tell. Distance becomes challenging. The closer objects look larger while the distant ones look smaller, even though the one in the greater distance may be a whole lot bigger than the one that's closer to you. Sometimes something looks like it's on one mountain is really on another mountain. And that's in the century around the coming of Yeshua, the Jewish rabbis struggled to make sense of these competing ideas about the Messiah, which were both often drawn from Isaiah, Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David. They saw the one who suffered and was rejected, and they saw the one who came in power and ruled on David's throne. And they would debate, they would argue whether it was two separate messiahs that each came once to fulfill a certain role, or was it one Messiah who came twice to fulfill both? And think about it like these mountains seen from a distance, right? And this is not a perfect analogy. I've been working on this in my confused states. But at times, from certain perspectives, both peaks can be seen clearly, and there are obvious differences, size, height, majesty. From this perspective, if someone was standing on the peak of one of these mountains, you could tell which one he was on, right? Isaiah chapter 2 and 6 is that vision of Messiah in the last days, when the mountain of Adonai's house is exalted above all the other mountains, and all the nations stream to it. All the world sees and knows this moment. All the world sees and knows this Messiah ben David. We would think of, when we think about Messiah ben Yosef, the suffering servant, to be of, we would, from our perspective anyway, of lesser majesty, lesser glory, something that the world doesn't even notice has happened. Right? Not the one that's raised up at the end. But just like with all the camels, those pictures of the camels, just with the picture of the zebra, perspective and vantage point changes everything. Because see, what seems obvious from a perspective like this can get obscured, because when Isaiah and Abraham were looking forward in time, many in the Tanakh saw Messiah's roles like this. How many peaks, how many mountains do you see? Men like Isaiah are looking at the mountains from a distance, straight on. Is it one mountain or is it two? Can you tell? It's not always easy to tell when you're looking straight at them both from a certain perspective. Can you tell which one is closer? Can you tell which one is bigger? How much distance is there between them? Which one is the man standing on? Don't get too nitpicky on my graphics here. I'm not that good. But when you're looking straight at them and they line up, when you see it from the side, but they line up, you can't necessarily tell how many you've got in front of you. You can't necessarily tell which one the man is standing on. Those in the Tanakh, what they knew with certainty is that Messiah is coming. That's what they knew. What they knew with certainty was that the kingdom of God was coming. How that would take place, the order, the time frame, what it would look like, where the details, that's where it gets a little murkier. One mountain may be smaller, but a lot closer than the other. Closer to the point that it's, blended. It may be closer and smaller, but when you line them up like that, the distance makes it look like they're about the same. From our place in time, this is our struggle. We can see from our place in time, we've already traveled past that first mountain, haven't we? With the first coming of Messiah. We've traveled past that so we can see it a little clearer. To where all that we know and all that we see clearly is the one that remains, with that picture of Messiah on the throne, that Isaiah 2 and 6, that's looming closer and closer and closer. Isn't it? It looks like it's getting bigger and bigger in our field of view and field of vision. But as often is the case, when you're hiking out in the mountains, the mountain can be so large that it's hard to gauge the distance of just how far away it really is and how far away we really are. Because it's so much bigger than anything we have experience with. And as we see the signs and effects of decline and conflict, to where we talk about the property value, food supplies, leadership, it's gonna cause us to take our eyes off of the destination of where we're going. We cannot lose sight of the promise and the future that He has for us. We cannot lose sight. In spite of all the things that's going on around us, we cannot lose sight. We cannot get distracted or fearful. We cannot turn to the right or to the left. Instead, we fix our eyes on Messiah. We fix our eyes on Yeshua, the goal, the prize. And so we run our race that's marked out for us with perseverance. And we continue moving toward that mountain. We continue moving with every step that we have, every breath that we take. We don't get lost and distracted and afraid by all the decline, because we know that He is coming. And the more we see the decline, the more we should see that clearly. Amen.